You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
The internet is full of stories about the Beatles. Dramatic stories, romantic stories, stories about four young men who changed the world, stories about screaming fans and sold-out concerts of music that touch billions of hearts. But there is one story that appears more often than any other, one story that gets millions of views, one story that people absolutely believe is true, down to their very core. It is a story about hate. It is a story about George Harrison hating someone more than anyone else. It is a story about two musicians who couldn't even look at each other. It is a story about betrayal, pain, and friendship destroyed by ambition. It is a story whispered in comment sections and shared across social media platforms and discussed in dormitory rooms around the world. The person George supposedly hated? Paul McCartney, his oldest friend, his bandmate, the man who believed in him when nobody else did, the man who brought him into the Beatles in the first place, the man who changed his life forever. But here's the question that nobody asks. Did George really hate Paul more than anyone? Or is this just another dramatic headline designed to get views? Is this just another story that the internet has twisted and exaggerated until it no longer resembles the truth? The answer is far more complicated and far more human than anyone talks about. Before we go deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to discover will change how you think about the Beatles forever. What you're about to learn will make you question everything you thought you knew about these four young men from Liverpool. And most importantly, it will remind you why the real stories, the complicated, messy human stories, are always more powerful than the dramatic headlines. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool, England. His childhood was not glamorous. There were no fancy cars or grand houses or servants waiting on his family hand and foot. His father, Harry Harisson, drove a bus for the local transport company. Every single day, he would wake up early, put on his uniform, and drive people around the city. It was honest work, but it was humble work. His mother, Louise, worked in a shop before becoming a homemaker. She raised George and his three older siblings with the kind of love that comes from sacrifice. She made sure there was always food on the table, even when money was tight. She made sure the children knew they were loved, even when the family couldn't afford luxuries. Money was always tight. Always. The Harrison family lived in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, where kids played in the streets because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else, where families gathered around the dinner table to share meals that were filling but not fancy, where dreams had to be big because reality was so small. But George Harrison had something that couldn't be bought with money, something that no amount of wealth could guarantee. He had a dream, and he had music. As a teenager, George picked up a guitar for the first time, and something inside him awakened. It was like the instrument had been waiting for him his entire life. It was like he had found the missing piece of his soul. His fingers were clumsy at first. When he pressed down on the steel strings, they cut into his soft fingertips. Blood would sometimes drip onto the fretboard. His hands would ache. His arms would feel tired. His shoulders would burn from holding the instrument in the same position for hours. But George didn't care. He practiced for hours every single day. Not because anyone made him. Not because he had to. But because he wanted to. Because he needed to. Because something inside him was screaming that this guitar, this music, this dream was what he was meant to do with his life. While his friends played football in the streets, George was alone in his room, making his fingers bleed to become better. While other teenagers were chasing girls and going to parties, George was studying chord progressions. While his classmates were enjoying their youth, George was sacrificing his present for a future he could only imagine. Years passed. His dedication became something almost spiritual. He wasn't just learning to play guitar. He was learning a language, a way to express things that words couldn't capture, a way to communicate emotions that were too big and too deep and too complex for ordinary conversation. He studied the legends. He listened to Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. He copied their techniques. He absorbed their styles. He learned not just how to play guitar, but how to use it to touch people's hearts. His mother watched her son transform. His father saw the dedication in George's eyes. His siblings understood that George was different, that he had been chosen for something special. By the time George was a teenager, everyone who knew him understood one thing. This quiet boy from Liverpool had talent, real talent, the kind of talent that doesn't come around very often. Very often. Then at school, everything changed. He met Paul McCartney. Paul was different from George. Paul was confident in a way that George wasn't. Paul was outgoing. Paul was the kind of person who walked into a room and people noticed. Paul had charm. Paul had charisma. Paul had the kind of personality that made people want to follow him. But Paul also noticed something in George that nobody else could see. Despite being younger than the other boys in Paul's social circle, George had a gift. George had something special. Paul could see it in the way George held his guitar. Paul could hear it in the way George played. Paul could feel it in the emotion that George poured into every note. Paul believed in George immediately. It was an unusual friendship. Paul was older. Paul was more experienced. Paul had already been playing in bands. But Paul saw something in this younger, quieter boy that made him want to help, that made him want to bring George into his world. Paul introduced George to John Lennon, who was leading a local band called the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen were making waves in Liverpool. They were playing at local clubs and dance halls. They were developing a following. They were becoming something special. John was skeptical when Paul suggested bringing George into the band. George looked too young. George looked too inexperienced. George didn't have the swagger that John liked in his musicians. George was quiet. George was thoughtful. George didn't seem like the kind of person who belonged in John's band. But then George played an audition that changed everything. It happened on the upper deck of a bus. Informal. Unplanned. Raw. There was no stage, no audience, no pressure. Just George with his guitar, playing for John Lennon. And it was extraordinary. George played a guitar solo that made John stop talking. That made John stop joking around. That made John understand that this quiet teenager was something special. The solo was technically perfect, but it was also something more than that. It had soul. It had emotion. It had the kind of authenticity that cannot be faked. John said yes. And in that moment, without knowing it, 3 young men from Liverpool had just set in motion the events that would change music forever. They had also set in motion something else, something darker, something that would create years of pain, years of misunderstanding, years of accumulated frustration that would eventually poison their greatest friendship. The dream was just beginning, but so was the suffering. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles had become more than just a band. They were a global phenomenon. Something that had never existed before in the history of music. They were 4 young men from a working-class city in England who had somehow captured the hearts and minds of the entire world. Every album they released broke records. Every song they wrote became #1. Every concert they performed sold out within minutes. Fans screamed at airports when the band members arrived. Concert halls filled with tears and excitement. Young girls cried just hearing their names mentioned on the radio. This was Beatlemania. And George Harrison was living inside the eye of a hurricane. He had achieved everything a teenager could dream of. Money, fame, beautiful women who wanted to know him, recognition from musicians around the world, the ability to travel everywhere, the power to make millions of people happy with his music, the celebrity, the adoration, the sense that he was part of something legendary. But inside the recording studio, away from the screaming crowds and the flashing cameras and the magazine covers, something was slowly poisoning everything. George was becoming a songwriter. It started quietly. A melody here, a chord progression there, small ideas that George would work on late at night when nobody was listening, ideas that came to him in moments of inspiration, ideas that felt important, ideas that felt true. But as time passed, these ideas became complete songs. Beautiful songs, powerful songs, songs that came from somewhere deep inside his soul, songs that meant something, songs that had something to say. George would imagine these songs on a Beatles album. He would imagine millions of people around the world hearing them. He would imagine his name on album credits alongside John and Paul. He would imagine finally being seen as more than just the guitar player. He would imagine being heard. He would imagine being respected. He would imagine being equal. But then something would happen that would break his heart, over and over and over again. John Lennon and Paul McCartney had established themselves as the Beatles' primary songwriters. Their partnership was legendary. They had been writing together for years. Years. They understood each other's creative language perfectly. They could finish each other's sentences. They knew what the other was thinking before it was said out loud. Their songwriting partnership was one of the greatest creative collaborations in music history. And naturally, their songs became the centerpiece of every album. George's songs were tolerated. That's the word that best describes how George's music was treated. Tolerated, not celebrated, not treasured, not given the same care and attention as John and Paul's work. Just tolerated. Album after album, the pattern repeated itself with terrible consistency. George would submit his songs. Sometimes they would be recorded. Sometimes they would be rejected. Sometimes Paul would suggest that George's song was good, but maybe not for this album. Sometimes John would decide that the song didn't fit the band's direction. Sometimes George's songs would simply be ignored until the deadline passed. When George's songs were recorded, they often received minimal studio time compared to John and Paul's tracks. George would get a few hours to record a song, while John and Paul would get days. George would be rushed through the recording process, while John and Paul would spend endless hours perfecting every detail. Sometimes George got only one song on an entire album, sometimes two if he was extremely lucky. Meanwhile, John and Paul had 5 songs, 6 songs, sometimes even 7 songs on the same albums. Think about this for a moment. Imagine working for years. Imagine creating something that you truly believed in with every fiber of your being. Imagine sharing your creation with your team, your friends, the people you respect most in the world. And imagine them saying, "That's nice, but we're going to focus on someone else's work instead." How would that feel? How would you react when this happened not once, but again and again and again? How would you feel when the people you loved, the people you had trusted, seemed to not believe in you? How would it affect your soul when your art was constantly dismissed? George felt invisible. He felt like he didn't matter. He felt like his talent wasn't good enough. He felt like nobody believed in him. And it was Paul who made it worse. Paul was a perfectionist. Some people called it genius. Others called it control. The truth was somewhere in between. Paul would spend 8 hours perfecting a single guitar riff. He would make musicians repeat the same part 30 times, 40 times, 50 times until it sounded exactly how he imagined it. He would give detailed instructions on how every instrument should be played. He would suggest changes and then suggest different changes, and then go back to the original and then try something completely new. He wanted everything perfect, and he wanted it his way. George had to watch as Paul treated his own songs with incredible care and attention. Hours spent, money spent, creative energy spent, all dedicated to making Paul's vision come to life. Paul would sit at the piano and work through the arrangement carefully. Paul would experiment with different instruments. Paul would think about how the song could be improved. But when George's turn came, it was rushed. It was dismissed. It was treated like it didn't matter as much. It was handled like a task to be completed, not a creation to be celebrated. If you're starting to feel frustration that George felt, please like this video right now. Your support helps us continue telling these untold stories about music's greatest legends. Then came 1966. George released a song called Taxman. It was biting. It was angry. It was political. It was George saying something that needed to be said. It showed the world that George Harrison wasn't just a supporting player. He was an artist with ideas and opinions. He was someone with something to contribute. He was someone with a voice that deserved to be heard. But Paul didn't like it. Paul suggested changes. Paul offered corrections. Paul wanted George to do it differently. Paul, as always, wanted control. Paul wanted to shape George's song into what Paul thought it should be. Then came Within You Without You in 1967. The song shocked everyone. It featured Indian instruments. It had a sitar. It had tabla drums. It sounded nothing like a typical Beatles song. George had discovered Indian music and Eastern philosophy. He was exploring spirituality. He was meditating. He was reading spiritual texts. He was becoming someone different from the boy who had joined the Quarrymen all those years ago. George was growing. George was evolving. George was becoming his own person. But Paul wanted the Beatles to stay exactly as they were. Paul wanted consistency. Paul wanted to protect the band sound. Paul wanted everything to remain under control. The tension was building silently beneath the surface. Then in 1968, George wrote a song that would become a masterpiece. It was called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It was one of the most beautiful songs George had ever written. It was emotional. It was sophisticated. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof, that George Harrison could write songs that matched anything John or Paul had ever created. But in the studio, something happened that George would never forget, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Paul wasn't satisfied with the guitar part that George had written for himself. Paul decided he wanted to play the guitar part instead. Think about that. Let that sink in. This was George's song. George had written it. George had composed it. George had poured his heart and soul into every note. George had created something beautiful, and Paul decided he knew better. Paul played the guitar part. George's original part was removed, erased, deleted from existence. It was like Paul was saying without words, "Your ideas aren't good enough. Your talent isn't good enough. Your contributions aren't valued. I will do it better." George felt humiliated. George felt disrespected. George felt like he was nothing in his own band. Then came something. This song would become one of the most famous Beatles songs ever recorded. It would be covered by hundreds of artists over the years. It would touch millions of hearts. It would be considered one of the greatest love songs ever written. And it was written by George Harrison. Even Paul McCartney, years later, would call it one of the greatest love songs ever written. Paul would acknowledge George's genius. Paul would finally give George credit. But during the recording sessions, guess who received the most attention? Guess who had created control? Guess who Paul spent hours perfecting? Not George. Paul shaped the song. Paul arranged it. Paul made it into something that reflected Paul's vision, not George's original vision. By January 1969, during the Get Back sessions, the tension had become unbearable. Cameras were filming everything. The Beatles had hired filmmakers to document the process of creating new music. Everything the band members did was being recorded. Every conversation, every emotion, every conflict. For the first time, the world would see the real disagreements between George and Paul, the real tension, the real pain. During one session, Paul was explaining how he wanted a guitar part to be played. George listened. George watched. George tried to follow Paul's instructions exactly. George was willing to do whatever it took to make the collaboration work. Paul kept explaining. Paul kept demonstrating. Paul kept correcting. Over and over and over. You could see it on camera. You could watch George's patience wearing thin. You could see his jaw tightening. You could see the frustration building in his eyes. You could see the moment when a human being reaches the absolute limit of what they can endure. Finally, with complete calmness, not anger, not shouting, not drama, just quiet resignation, George turned to Paul and said, "I'll play whatever you want to play or I won't play at all." Those words were quiet. They weren't yelled. They weren't spoken in anger. They were simply stated as a fact. But they carried years of pain, years of rejection, years of watching Paul control everything while George's genius went unrecognized, years of feeling invisible, years of being treated as less important. The room went silent. Nobody spoke. Everyone understood that something fundamental had broken. And a few days later, George did something shocking. He walked out of the Beatles. Not to cool off, not for a few hours, not to make a point. He quit. He told the band he was leaving. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He said the pain was too deep. He said he couldn't be in a band where his voice didn't matter. For the first time in nearly a decade, George Harrison was no longer a Beatle. The other band members panicked. They understood immediately what George's absence meant. Without George, there was no Beatles sound. Without George's guitar, without his songs, without his presence, the Beatles were incomplete. They had lost something irreplaceable. Paul had to apologize. Not a complete apology, not a full acknowledgement of how badly he had hurt George, but enough to make George consider coming back. John had convinced George to return. John, who was dealing with his own issues and his own changes, had to put aside his own problems to help bring the band back together. Ringo had to mediate. Ringo, who was often the peacemaker in the band, had to use his diplomatic skills to help heal the rift. Eventually, after meetings and discussions and promises, George agreed to return, but he wasn't the same George anymore. Something had died inside him. The trust had been broken. The belief that they were in this together had been shattered. Drop a comment below and tell me, if you were George, would you have come back? Or would you have walked away forever? Now here's where most videos about George Harrison get it completely wrong. They create a simple story. George hated Paul. Paul didn't respect George. George was a victim. Paul was a villain. End of story. But the real truth is far more complex, and far more human, and far more tragic. George's hatred for Paul wasn't really about Paul at all. It was about something much deeper. George Harrison felt invisible. For years, literally years, George had been standing in the shadow of two men. John and Paul had captured the world's attention. Their songwriting partnership was legendary. Their names were on the covers of magazines. Their faces were on the covers of albums. Their creativity was celebrated and analyzed and discussed. But George was the third option, always the third. George knew the truth, though. George knew he was just as talented as John and Paul. George knew his songs deserved the same attention. George knew he had something important to say. George knew that his music mattered. And Paul's behavior in the studio, the perfectionism, the control, the refusal to accept George's ideas as equally valid, felt like confirmation of what George secretly feared. That nobody would ever see him as an equal. That he would spend his entire life in the Beatles being treated like a sidekick. That his talent would never be fully recognized. That his voice would never be truly heard. So yes, George hated Paul. But it wasn't a simple hatred based on one argument or one moment. It was the accumulated pain of years of being overlooked. Years of being told his ideas weren't good enough. Years of watching the man who introduced him to band, who believed in him when nobody else did, now becoming the man who prevented him from being heard. Here's what's important to understand. Paul didn't do this out of malice. Paul wasn't trying to hurt George. Paul wasn't trying to diminish George's contributions. Paul wasn't trying to steal George's voice or his talent or his recognition. Paul was trying to make the best music possible. Paul's perfectionism came from his genuine belief that he knew what sounded good. Paul's need for control came from his passion for the Beatles' sound. Paul believed that by controlling the details, by perfecting every element, he was serving the music and the band. But Paul never understood how it made George feel. Paul was so focused on creating perfect music that he forgot about the perfect human being standing right next to him. A human being who was suffering. A human being who was struggling. A human being who was slowly dying inside. The hate that George felt wasn't really about Paul's actions. It was about George's pain. And that pain was real. That pain was justified. That pain would change the course of the Beatles' history. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, George did something that shocked the world. Only months later, he released an album called All Things Must Pass. It was a triple album, 3 entire records, filled with songs that George had written but never been allowed to record with the Beatles. Songs that had been rejected, songs that had been dismissed, songs that Paul had deemed not good enough for the Beatles. My Sweet Lord, What Is Life? Isn't It a Pity? Wah wah. Song after song after song. All of them beautiful. All of them powerful. All of them proof that George Harrison had been a genius all along. A genius that the Beatles, and Paul McCartney specifically, had been holding back. The album was a massive commercial success. Critics called it brilliant. Fans loved it. It won awards and accolades and recognition from around the world. And George proved something to himself and to the world. He didn't need the Beatles. He didn't need Paul. He was talented enough to succeed on his own. In fact, his solo career was so successful that many people began to wonder. Had Paul been holding George back all these years? Had Paul's need for control actually prevented George from reaching his full potential? The answer seemed obvious to many people. Yes, Paul had held George down. Paul had prevented George's voice from being heard. Paul had stolen years from George's career. And now that George was free, his true genius could finally shine. Years passed. George and Paul didn't speak to each other. Not for years. Not for a long time. The silence between them was deafening. When they gave interviews, journalists would ask about each other. George would sometimes criticize Paul. He would talk about how controlling Paul had been in the studio. He would mention the pain of feeling unheard in the Beatles. He would acknowledge the damage that had been done. Paul would defend himself in interviews. He would say he was just trying to make good music. He would argue that his perfectionism had been necessary to keep the Beatles at the highest level. He would claim that his suggestions had always been in service of the music, but they never talked directly to each other. They existed in separate worlds, both successful, both famous, but both carrying the weight of unfinished business, both carrying years of accumulated hurt, both wondering if things could ever be repaired. If you're enjoying this journey through music history, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss our documentaries about the untold stories of music's greatest legends. And yet something remarkable happened as time passed. George changed as a person. His spiritual journey deepened. He was meditating more. He was reading more spiritual texts. He was traveling to India to study with spiritual masters. He was beginning to understand that anger and hatred only created more suffering, that holding on to grudges only poisoned your own soul. George was learning the Buddhist principle of forgiveness. He was learning that forgiveness wasn't about saying that what happened was okay. Forgiveness was about letting go of the anger so that it no longer controlled your life. Forgiveness was about choosing peace over pain. And slowly, the hatred began to soften. They began to see each other differently. They began to speak again, not as enemies, not as rivals, but as two men who had shared something extraordinary together and had paid a terrible price for taking each other for granted. They met on different occasions. They spoke respectfully about each other's talents. They shared memories of the extraordinary journey they had experienced together. They never returned to the close friendship of their teenage years. But neither did they remain locked in endless bitterness. In 1994, George gave an interview where he spoke about his relationship with Paul. He said something that contradicted everything the internet had been claiming. People think I hated Paul, but that's not really true. I was frustrated. I was angry, but I never truly hated him. The hatred had transformed into something different, something more mature, something more human. George Harisson died on November 29, 2001, from cancer. He was 58 years old. Tributes came from around the world. Musicians honored his memory. Fans celebrated his music. His family mourned the loss of a man they loved. Paul McCartney mourned the loss of his friend, the man he had once battled with in the studio, the man he had once competed with for recognition, the man whose talent he had once tried to control. And in his grief, Paul finally understood. All the battles hadn't mattered. All the arguments hadn't mattered. All the pain they had inflicted on each other. It all seemed so small in the face of death. What mattered was the music they had created together. What mattered was a friendship they had shared, even when it was broken. What mattered was that they had been part of something greater than themselves. The real story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney isn't a story about hatred. It's a story about two flawed human beings who hurt each other, who struggled to understand each other, who eventually found a way to forgive. It's a story about how time can heal even the deepest wounds. It's a story about talent and insecurity and the need to be recognized. It's a story about perfectionism and its cost. It's a story about friendship and how fragile it can be. Everyone faces moments when they feel overlooked or misunderstood. Maybe you've experienced that at work, at school, or even within your own family. Maybe you felt invisible. Maybe you felt like your contributions didn't matter. Maybe you felt the sting of rejection from someone you loved. George's story reminds us that even the most successful people struggle to be heard, and that honest communication can be one of life's greatest challenges. The loudest voices are not always the strongest. Sometimes, the quietest person leaves the deepest impact. If this story moved you, please share this video with someone you know. Comment below and tell me what you think about George's journey. And if you've ever felt hurt by someone you cared about, remember George's path. Remember that forgiveness is possible. Remember that time can change everything. Thank you for watching our journey through one of music's most complex relationships.